Hello, my name is Philip Plotch, and I'm the principal researcher here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars. We're an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit think tank, and we focus on multimodal transportation issues. Today, we're going to hear from Anna Zevarts. She's the author of a new book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. Anna's going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions from all of you. Whenever you want, you can enter questions into the Q&A box on the right side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. We hope you enjoy our webinar, and we hope you can help support us by donating or becoming a member of Eno. Just check out the link in the chat box. And with that, here's Anna.
Thank you. It's great to be here today. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Seattle, and I'm thrilled to get to share with you about my book and talk about what brought me to write this book and what you can take away from it into your work today. So to begin, this is a cover of the book, and I encourage you, we'll share a link later where you can get a discount to it on the Island Press store. You can also request it from your local library. I actually just heard about someone who requested it, and then someone else checked it out before they even got it. So it's a great way to make sure that it reaches more folks. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about where I came from and what inspired me to write this book. I was born in Washington State, and this image on the left here is the street where I grew up. It's in the woods. It's a rural road, no sidewalks, no shoulders. And I was born with a vision neurological condition. It's called nystagmus, and it makes my eyes shake a little bit all the time. So if you look very carefully, you might be able to notice it now. And what that does is it means that I can't see far distances very well. I have a hard time seeing details, and I also have a hard time tracking fast-moving objects. So driving for me is not safe. I tried to get a driver's license as a teenager. I couldn't pass the vision test. And I hadn't really contemplated what this was going to mean for my life. I didn't understand that there were places where not everyone drove everywhere, right? In my experience, all the adults in my life drove where they needed to go. And the only way I could get places was to ask for rides. And as a teenager, I didn't like that. I didn't like having to ask my parents to pick me up places or take me places always. And so I really wanted a different future for myself, and I moved to New York City. And New York City, this image on the right, is where I lived in Inwood, actually right across the river in the South Bronx, near one of the subway overhead subways, and the street is full of people. And I moved to New York because the subway there ran 24 hours a day, and that idea that I could go anywhere I wanted, I could get home at midnight, I wouldn't have to be relying on others, for me was an incredible experience. And in having that experience, it was great because I didn't have to tell people, I didn't have to tell friends, I didn't have to tell employers, I didn't have to worry about what jobs I applied to, because I really could get where I needed to go. A driver's license wasn't something that employers even asked about when I went to apply for jobs. That changed. In 2016, I moved back to Washington State. I had a kid. I wanted to be closer to family. And I also wanted to connect more with the disability community, because I realized that growing up, I really hadn't known other disabled folks. There was a lot of shame and stigma around disability, and I had internalized that. And so I wanted the chance to sort of start to work in that space again. And as I started working for Disability Rights Washington, I started meeting many other people who couldn't drive and couldn't afford to drive. And that made me feel so much less alone. And it also made me start thinking about, how underrepresented the stories of non-drivers are in our communities. Next slide. And so at Disability Rights Washington, we started to create what we called our Transportation Access for Everyone's Story Map. And this was a project where we began to interview non-drivers from throughout the state, and really intentionally looking for stories from people from every legislative district. Because I think there's this assumption that, people who can't drive live in big cities, people who choose not to drive live in big cities, and people who can't afford to drive, right, live in big cities. And the reality is there are non-drivers all over the community, our communities, whether it's rural areas, suburban areas, tribal areas. And in cities, there are people who can't drive and can't afford to drive. And this story map project really helped us make visible some of those stories. This image on the right is my colleague Abby and I doing an outreach event with folks who had recently immigrated from Iran and Afghanistan, who many of whom couldn't afford vehicles and also didn't have driver's licenses. And so we, had the opportunity to collect these stories and do this work. And it made me realize that I wished I had seen these stories when I was a young person growing up in Washington State, that I had realized that it is possible to get around without driving and that there are many other people in that situation, whether by choice or not by choice, and that we can actually begin to design communities, places like New York City, places where there are reliable transit systems, even rural areas with reliable transit, where non-drivers can be included in community. And I wanted this to exist in the world so that young people out there and people who are perhaps facing a disability and losing the ability to drive could understand that they weren't alone. And so that's really what inspired me to write this book. Next slide. So I want to just, before we get into the Q&A, give you a quick sort of overview of who I'm talking about when I talk about non-drivers and what some of the biggest issues that we face as far as transportation access. And the book really centers the stories of disabled non-drivers, like myself, people who are low vision and blind, people with mobility disabilities, mental health, chronic health, epilepsy. There's all kinds of disabilities that can make driving either unsafe or unsafe some of the time, or could require a vehicle that, you need a wheelchair accessible vehicle or a vehicle with hand controls, and those vehicles are more expensive. And so because there's so much poverty in the disability community, many people are unable to drive. And people with disabilities are actually 4 times less likely to drive than people without disabilities, which I don't know. I think that may be surprising to the general public, because I think there's this assumption or sort of conflation with that disabled parking placard with driving, and an assumption that disabled people drive, but that really isn't the reality. And next slide. The other part of this is that there are many people who wouldn't choose to use the word disabled to describe themselves, or they don't identify that way, but they can't safely drive. And so when I talk about this work and I talk about our non-driver story map, and I talk about non-drivers, I use the word non-driver to be able to include folks who don't want to, for whatever reason, whether it's cultural, whether it's the stigma around disability, don't like that term. And in this group, I would include a lot of older folks who are aging out of driving. This is an image of my grandma. She had a heart condition. She would pass out unexpectedly. She kept driving. She really shouldn't have been. And, there are a lot of older folks in our country who are approaching that point where it's no longer safe to drive. And yet, because of the way our communities are designed, like my grandma, they feel like they don't have other options. Next slide. So another segment of the non-driver population are people who can't afford to drive. We talked about poverty in the disability community, but there are also, to own a car is expensive, to maintain a car is expensive. Insurance rates have really increased lately. The cost of gas can be a real burden. And so you see a lot of non-drivers are people who cannot afford a car or have other expenses that are more pressing. And so car ownership is not a priority for them. And we saw this, really, really clearly during the pandemic. These are some images from Seattle, from my bus route in South Seattle, where, in some of the areas where there were a lot of folks who had the option to drive on transit as the pandemic happened, people who had the choice to avoid the buses, or to be able to stay home and work from home, really didn't use transit. Whereas routes that served low-income communities and communities of color, those routes continued to see a lot of use and ridership. And one of those routes was the 7 bus in Seattle. And these images are from the pandemic and the 7 bus, where people were using it to get around, to get groceries. And in the US, because of the racialized nature of poverty, Black households are 3 times less likely to have a car than white households, which I think is a really shocking statistics. And we have to remember that, if you think about who in your own world, who has access to a car. Perhaps you think every adult drives. The reality is that's just not true. And there are many communities where driving or having access to a car isn't an assumption you can make. Next slide. And so the last big chunk of non-drivers, and this is a significant chunk, are folks who are young folks who have not yet gotten a driver's license, can't afford a car, or who are too young to drive. And young people in particular in this country are driving a lot less than they used to. This could be cost related. From when I was a teenager in the 90s to now, we've seen about a 50% decrease in the number of 16-year-olds with driver's licenses. So big decrease, whether that's by choice or economic necessity. Young people are driving less than they used to. And then next slide. Children are also a big percentage of the non-drivers. And, about almost 50% of non-drivers are people under the age of 16. And when I include children and include them, and when I talk about non-drivers, some people question that. Children shouldn't count. They should be their own category. They can't go places independently. A parent can drive them. There's all these assumptions around the mobility of caretakers when you talk about children. But the reality is not all caretakers have the ability to drive, have access to a car. And at the same time, many children in the right situations can get where they need to go independently. We create a whole school busing system, right? Specifically because we recognize that not all parents or caregivers have the ability to always drive their kids everywhere they need to go. And so we need to create systems that can work for children. We do this in rural areas where we don't have regular transit for other folks. And so, children are part of our communities, and we need to be thinking about the mobility needs of children as well as the mobility needs of everyone over the age of 16. Next slide. So altogether, about a third of the population in the US are non-drivers. And I think this is a shocking statistic to people because there's such an assumption that, well, everyone who counts drives, right? Everyone who's important or who we need to think about, like driving is how they get around. And yet it's not a feasible alternative for so many of us. Whether, that's because we're too young, too old, aging out of, have a chronic health condition, disabled, can't afford to, right? Don't know how to, right? There's so many of us who need systems that are different. Next slide. So I mentioned, thinking about in your own life, who do you know who's a non-driver? On your street, in your family, in your community, at your work, perhaps, among your friends, among, people you maybe go to church with, like who are the people who can't drive? And if you don't know a lot of people who can't drive, thinking about, why is that, right? And how do people in your community get around? How do people who don't have that option get where they need to go? And I'm going to sort of, if you want to reflect on this in the chat, it's definitely something we can continue to sort of talk about. I did a webinar recently for the DOT, and it was really interesting to have so many folks there on that webinar put into the chat all the people they knew in their lives who couldn't drive. And I think it really is like, when we start to reflect on this, we can start to think about, okay, yeah, we can actually begin to design communities that work better for everyone and not exclude such a large percentage of the population. Next slide. So I was talking right before this webinar started, how do people with disabilities and people who can't drive, people who can't afford to drive, how do we get around? In Washington State, we funded a study. We got a study funded through our state legislature that looked at, the percentage of non-drivers and also how non-drivers get around. And the biggest, most common way non-drivers get around in Washington State, at least, was asking for rides from friends and family. And, this can work if you have a social network that you can rely on. But even if you have that social network, it comes at a cost. There's an emotional burden that comes along with that. And so there's an image here of Jaime Torres who describes, the frustration and sort of the isolation that comes from always having to ask for rides. And especially if some of your trips are seen as discretionary, how difficult it can be to ask others for rides. Next slide. Paying for rides is also an option, though this is an option that is not available to many non-drivers who are low income or disabled, or only an option in emergencies. There's also, a real lack of wheelchair accessible vehicles for hire in pretty much every community outside of a couple large cities in our country. And so, paying for rides is not necessarily a reliable option. And there's an image here of Amandeep, who's in the blind community, and talks about, just the poverty in the blind community. And when we saw really heavily subsidized Uber and Lyft rides, it became more of an option for some people for a while, but then that's gone away as those prices have gone back up to reflect more of the real cost of driving someone somewhere. Next slide. So transit for many of us is a wonderful option because it allows us to get places without having to ask for rides, without having to spend a huge amount of our income on paying for rides. And it can be an option even in more rural areas if we're able to figure out ways, and the frequency and reliability of transit is really important. But even in places where, there's not the population density to support super frequent transit, having transit serve at least daily or a couple times a week can be the difference between someone being totally stuck at home and being able to get to a local grocery store or to a coffee shop and see friends. This is an image of Abby, who grew up in a more rural area and then was able to move into a city, and just described the difference between her emotional well-being when she was able to get out and get places. Next slide. When we're building these transit systems, then we need to remember that it's not just about transit. We also need to make sure that people can get to transit, and a big piece of that is having an accessible network of sidewalks, of crossings. There's some images here of inaccessible sidewalks, of bus stops without safe places to wait for the bus, of bus stops without paving. And that sidewalk piece often gets overlooked because for people without disabilities, perhaps it's less critical. It doesn't block access as it does as much for other folks. And so we need to make sure that we're maintaining the sidewalk networks and thinking about that as part of our transit connections. Next slide. Land, and I hear all the time, okay, well, this is expensive. It's expensive to do these things. We can't afford them. We can't afford sidewalks. But then I look at some of the things that we in our state in Washington spend a lot of money on, whether that's new highway construction, new boulevards, snow removal through some of our mountain passes. And it's frustrating to think that we can't manage the same level of investment or level of commitment or level of vision for people who are moving outside of vehicles. Next slide. Land use is another key part of the solution, and is actually really the root of how we can make our communities accessible. Because if there's not affordable housing near where we need to go, if we're designing communities around the need to store large quantities of vehicles, if we're designing communities that require moving between far distances to get where we need to go, and that there's not really the density to support reliable transit, that can make it really difficult for non-drivers. And so at the end of the day, these land use decisions, these zoning decisions do inform the kinds of opportunities that non-drivers have to be full participants. Next slide. And so, one sort of shortcut or hack perhaps for some of the land use problems that we have in the US is the e-mobility, right? And I'm talking about e-mobility like electric bikes, electric wheelchairs, electric scooters, because these can solve some of the distance problems that we have when communities are so spread out, or the distances we need to travel are so difficult. But that requires investing in the kind of infrastructure we need to be able to get places safely, whether that's multimodal trails, whether that's storage for e-bikes, whether that's actually the power wheelchairs that can be out in all kinds of weather and have the batteries they need to last for far distances. So next slide. To to get to a place where we have inclusive communities. I mean, I mentioned some of those solutions here with transit, with land use, with electric bikes and electric scooters, but we also need to make sure that we have more non-drivers in the room as part of the decision-making processes in our agencies and our government and elected office. And so making sure that when we're creating job postings, when we're thinking about who we're recruiting and hiring, we're thinking about recruiting and hiring people with the experience of non-drivers. And so we need to stop requiring things like driver's licenses for jobs where driving is not an essential function. And the states like California are considering legislation to do this right now. I hope other states take that lead, follow that lead, and pass legislation as well. The other thing, next slide, we can do is begin to experience life as non-drivers, whether that's participating in walk roll audits. This is an image here of a walk roll audit organized by our state DOT that involved community members from the disability community. We can also participate in the Week Without Driving Challenge, which is a challenge that we launched here in Washington State in 2021, and it's now a national challenge. Next slide. The Week Without Driving, really the idea is for elected leaders, for decision makers, for people who work in the transportation industry to have the opportunity to experience life as a non-driver. And for this year, the challenge is happening September 30th through October 6th, so you still have time to sign up and join us in experiencing what it is like to get around your community and do what you need to do throughout the week. All the things, not just your work trips, but in the evenings, your social activities, your caregiving responsibilities. Can you do it without driving yourself and experience what that would be like and how we could actually change things to make things better? Next slide. So the Week Without Driving, if you want to learn more, go to weekwithoutdriving.org. You can sign up. You can read more about the challenge. You also are welcome to follow me on social media. And then there's a code here. You can use the code webinar to get the book. But I want to turn it back over to Eno, and I think we're going to do some Q&A, which is always my favorite part of these book talks. So opening it up for Q&A. Thanks.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for the presentation, and feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box. So first thing I want to ask you is, you mentioned New York City as sort of a role model for transit, but I'm guessing there's a lot of Americans out there who don't want to live in a place like New York City. Are there other places that you think could be role models, smaller places, quieter places that have good transportation for people with different kinds of disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, New York City, for me as someone who could go up and down stairs, right? New York City was great. But the inaccessibility of the subway system and of legacy subways and transit in many of our larger, older cities is a real problem and can be a significant barrier, right? So I know that it's not this, ideal place for a lot of people. I think, we have, but to get to your question around, where else is a model? I mean, I think what makes New York City work for non-drivers is that there is such a majority of non-drivers. And so as a result, you have the political will most of the time. And I know the congestion pricing thing perhaps refutes some of this, but there are a lot of people who really care very deeply about the transit system working, about sidewalks, existing, right? Where in other parts of the country, the people who are most likely to be transit riders, to not have cars, are probably the people with less political power. And so you don't necessarily get the investments that you need to prioritize transit, to prioritize investments in sidewalks, to prioritize. And then you have, this idea that, well, okay, this American ideal is that we, have a lot of space, that we have, we're spread out. There's not that density of housing. There's not that density of land use. And I think, I think we need to actually work on changing that narrative because for accessibility reasons in our communities, we have to be able to have things closer together. And for climate and public health reasons, we can't continue to, and housing affordability, right? Like if we're continuing to just take up more and more land, the distances we have to travel are far. The amount of infrastructure we have to maintain is large, and the costs of doing that, both climate and financial are large. So I think we have to push back against that narrative that that people don't want to live in more dense environments. We just don't have very many places except for New York where it's actually a reality.
Right. So the other question was, or the other part of the question was, are there other examples of places that you could think of where you might say, hey, they're doing a really good job of allowing people to get around who otherwise would have trouble?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I lived for a bit in Tucson, Arizona, and there's a lot of things that Tucson is incredibly car centric, right? And it's got these really high crash rates as a result of it, and high pedestrian rates. So I'm not saying it's ideal, but you do have some pieces because it's so spread out, right? It's not as, I think, controversial to build some of the bike infrastructure that you have, these fights in other communities, and so. I liked living there because there was, this bike, the loop right around the city. You could get around. There was a lot of infrastructure on streets and some protected infrastructure, right, to be able to bike places and roll places safely and comfortably. So I think that's an example. I think there's also examples of rural communities that are thinking about, okay, the town itself is small, right? And so that land use piece is good. And then making sure people who live further out have safe options to walk or roll into town. Can you build, parallel trails along some of these rural highways? The Yakama Nation here in Washington State is thinking about and planning to do some of this work to make sure that, people who live further out in rural areas can get where they need to go safely, even if they don't have a vehicle.
I have some people who are piping in saying, hey, how about my where I live? So Washington, D.C. Somebody said, hey, I think Washington, D.C. does a really good job. So I don't know if you've spent any time in D.C.
I have, and the subway is great. I remember when I was in my 20s, I spent some time in DC, and the only reason I picked New York over DC is because I wanted a 24-hour subway, because at the age of 22, that was very important to me. Now, I would be totally content with a subway that didn't run 24 hours. But no, and DC, I think, has also done a lot of work around bike infrastructure. I love going there now and being able to use the bike share and check out there's just, a ton of protected bike infrastructure that's been built in the last 10 years. That's really exciting. And there is the metro system there.
Yeah. So you mentioned transit, and I was thinking about a recent experience I had in Philadelphia trying to figure out how to go from one place to another. And I had so much trouble figuring out the signage and where the routing is going. I would imagine somebody visually impaired would have it. I don't know if they could have figured it out at all. It was so hard. Do you think that's an important element of providing good transportation, making sure that the information works well for everybody?
Yeah, wayfinding and how to make wayfinding accessible, I think, is a really interesting conversation. And I think it's not settled, right? There's obviously technology and new technology that can be really helpful. There's ways for a lot of this to be digitized, but then there's also, folks who aren't comfortable using more of those digital solutions, or there's times when, say, your cell phone dies, right? Or you don't have a cell phone, or whatever, the system goes down, where you need other forms of wayfinding to exist. And so I guess my takeaway with wayfinding just broadly is that it's good for it to exist in as many ways as possible. And, as someone who can't read signs that are up, up higher, I love wayfinding routes that are painted on the ground. There's tactile wayfinding options as well. But I think, trying different things and being open to having multiple and duplicative wayfinding systems, I think is important, because not everything's going to work for everyone, and not everything's going to work all the time.
Yeah. So just so you know, you're getting invitations now to come to Minneapolis and St. Paul and to Cleveland, because supposedly those are great places, and I think we'll get some more coming in too.
Cool.
So you mentioned bicycling, and I think that might surprise people that you're talking about not being able to drive, and then all of a sudden you mentioned bicycles. So explaining.
Yeah, I think that does surprise people for sure. I mean, and so, I have enough vision to bike. I don't, have enough vision to bike super fast. And I feel like I am pretty aware of some of my limitations, but I think there's an assumption that disabled people don't bike. And I think there's historically perhaps some tension between bike advocates and the disability community, because there's not always an understanding that some of the things bike advocates push for can actually make it harder for, in particular, blind folks to get around. But there are a lot of folks that cross both communities, and biking can be a really great option. I know lots of other low vision folks who bike who can't drive, and I'm not the only one out there. There's also folks with mobility disabilities who can find a bike to be similar to a mobility device, and that it can make it possible to go distances that they wouldn't be able to go without that mobility device. So yeah, we need to do a better job of talking about those overlaps, I think. And also sort of breaking down the stigma that biking is just for, super able-bodied people, or, able-bodied white dudes, right? Like there's just that we need to, right? We need to show that there are other people out there, but then also we need to make sure that we're designing infrastructure that works for other people's, for all of these uses, right? And including, that bike infrastructure that's wide enough for non-traditional bikes, right? Or bike storage, that's possible. If you're having a heavier trike, there's no way you're carrying that up and down stairs, right, into a bike storage facility or an apartment. Can we make sure that we have secure places to lock up larger or non-traditional bikes as well?
So now I have to start each question with some more places that people want you to go visit. So now we have Ann Arbor, Fort Collins, Madison, Atlanta, and Chicago. So we're adding to that list.
Cool. I did actually go to Madison, I think 2 years ago. I fell in love. It was lovely. It was the springtime too. Everyone was like, you better come back in winter before you move here. But yes.
So somebody made a point that university towns, because there's a lot of students who don't drive, are probably different than other kinds of places, like really oriented possibly more towards non-drivers.
I would agree with that. And I think it comes down to what I was saying earlier about, New York, or these places where there is, this, when you start to build the political power of non-drivers, things shift. And maybe it's not everything, but they do shift. And I think that's important to consider. And part of why I think, I wanted to write this book is because I wanted to make visible that there are non-drivers that, there's a much larger percentage already everywhere than we're thinking about. And we need to start making that piece visible so that we can start to argue for different kinds of transportation and land use investments.
Yeah. So, you got me a little concerned about something. I'm feeling like this chicken and egg problem we have now. Like, it's hard to advocate in certain places for these kinds of improvements you're talking about if you don't have a strong political will for it. But you don't get a strong political will for it until you start to build that coalition and to get more people using those kinds of services. So as an advocate, so you're an advocate for these kinds of things. Can you tell us a little bit how you approach that problem of trying to get more political will and trying to get policymakers to make changes?
Yeah, no, I think that is like the root of it, right? But I think that the reality is that there are people in every community who can't drive or can't afford to drive. And so making that part visible and starting with those voices, right? And creating this space, and it is hard work, right? I'm not saying this is easy for people who can't drive to be present and be visible in places where decisions are getting made. And so whether that's, if you're a planner, figuring out how can you have a community, a community advisory board, and how can you create stipends? How can you make sure there's transportation and childcare and food and like ways for people to be able to show up who wouldn't normally be able to show up, or multiple ways for people to give input who maybe can't get there easily in person. A lot of the work I did sort of before this book around collecting stories was in the midst of the pandemic where nobody could travel anywhere. And it actually, for non-drivers, right, it was in some ways all the remote ability to participate in things made life so much easier because we weren't then excluded because the event was in person and we couldn't get there. So being really intentional about, okay, how do we, who is not in the room right now, who is a non-driver in our community, and how can we make sure those voices are present? And I guess one other part of that is reaching out. I think, For folks who have driven their whole lives and then suddenly can't drive, there's a lot of anger usually. And then also, I think it's harder for people to imagine building a life around not driving because they've had that kind of driving access for so many years. And so I would recommend reaching out and being intentional about finding folks in the disability community who perhaps have never been able to drive or have not been able to drive for a long time and have figured out some of these hacks. And I think there's perhaps, and especially in the blind community, a lot of hope about, okay, and desire to make transit work better, to make walking, places more walkable, right? Because this is our reality. This is going to be our reality. We're not suddenly going to be able to afford a car and like things are going to change, right? I would say that there's a lot of potential there to find the people who are going to be really, really solid fighters in the desire to change things, to make things more inclusive.
Yeah. All right. So the next question gets prefaced with 3 new cities: Davis, California, Salt Lake City, and Victoria, British Columbia, that you need to go visit. So one of the really powerful messages that I hear from you is this personal aspect of like what you've gone through, and your book talks about your personal experiences. And to me, that's so much different than another person talking about it. So I'm curious, as a mom, like I've always thought about visually impaired people getting to work or maybe getting to the grocery store or the doctor, but it must be very different being a mom thinking about how to get your kids around. Is that something that surprised you? It's something that you've been dealing with, something that other people maybe don't think about?
Yeah, I mean, it is for sure. And it's actually one of the most frustrating parts about living in Seattle, because most other caregivers who can afford to have vehicles, just because it is, the way that you look up directions for something in Seattle and you can get almost anywhere in the city in 15 minutes in a car driving yourself. Transit, to some of the further places, it's, 2 hours for me. It's regularly an hour. Biking similarly, just because of the hills and a lot of the direct routes you can't bike on. And so, yeah, there's that disparity, and it's frustrating. And I often fantasize about moving back to New York, where, so many more parents aren't driving. And the assumption isn't that parents all drive to everything always. But, I am reminded every time I get on the bus in Seattle, there are a lot of other parents, and it's, it's not parents who can't afford to drive who are using transit. And that is true, I think, in every community. And so, there's this like white middle class assumption that, driving is how you're going to get your kids to all your activities, but that isn't everyone. And just one piece of this, I think that transit planners perhaps forget is that, there are lots of parents who cannot drive for a whole host of reasons or cannot afford to. And so if we're thinking about designing transit systems and experimenting with like micro transit, we have to remember that parents are part of the transit riding population. And so we need to make sure that these systems can work for transit. So if we're replacing, say, a fixed route bus with a like via type, shuttle, how are parents going to be able to use that service? Is it going to work without a car seat? Because there are going to be parents who need it. And so that piece, I think, is, even if sort of the parents in your social sphere don't ride transit, there are parents in every community who do.
Yeah. Okay. So somebody suggests that you go to Oslo. I don't know if you've ever been to Oslo, Norway.
I have not been to Oslo. That sounds fun.
And then somebody else asked a question about airports and whether airports, you think, or airlines do a pretty good job helping people who are with disabilities, especially visually impaired people.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of media attention right now on the difficulties of flying with a wheelchair, and how often wheelchairs get broken and how devastating that can be, because the repair times are not fast, right? And so people can be without any mobility as a result of that. So that is a significant piece. I think I get frustrated a little bit because, airports and air travel is something that is, more affordable to folks with more resources. And when you compare sort of the infrastructure that we build around our airports and how comfortable and convenient relatively it can be in an airport compared to, say, a transit center, Greyhound station, right? That piece to me is frustrating. I know that, the federal government right now, I think I saw some press release where they're investing $5 billion in airport accessibility and $1 billion in transit. And it's just like, okay, but when you think about the inaccessibility of so much of our legacy transit systems versus the newness, the amount of infrastructure investment we're putting into airports, it does seem to reflect the financial resources of who uses these two systems. And that to me is a little frustrating.
Yeah. All right. So the next question, and first a shout out to Burlington, Vermont, and Philadelphia is nice places to go visit. So there was a question or a statement that I found kind of troubling just thinking about it. Somebody wrote there are significant aging and poor populations in rural areas, but I think they feel like not driving is their fault instead of something systematic that needs to be fixed. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's this idea, well, okay, if you live in a rural area and you can't drive, you should just move to a city, right? And I, as someone who very intentionally as a young person had the opportunity to move to a city, I had some of that bias for sure.
Yeah.
But doing this work and getting to talk to more rural non-drivers made me, there's someone in the book, Nancy Perrone, who I interviewed, who lives outside of Aberdeen, Washington. It's like home of Kurt Cobain, former logging area. Now, a lot of it's actually starting to come back, but for a while there, a lot of economic devastation. Folks can't afford necessarily to move into a city, even like a rural city with, a rural small town like that.
Yeah.
That move can be prohibitively expensive. And so, and then there's also just like, if your family and your network is somewhere, it's not realistic to say, okay, I'm going to uproot myself and go to this place where I don't have that kind of support. So, Nancy helped me really see like, okay, we can have, and there used to be rural transit, right, in this area where she lived, and through sort of, budget cuts over the years, through anti-government, anti-tax sort of initiatives, that service got hacked away. But, and this is when I'm talking about like the need for, even if it's just a once or twice a week route that runs through an area and provides people the ability to, make a trip into town, that can be really important. That we can also, sort of backstop things with all these sort of volunteer driver networks, human services, transportation, those are good. But they also, you're limited then to sort of asking for rides in a way where with fixed route transit, it gives you that choice without sort of having to ask for permission.
All right. So Walla Walla, Idaho, supposedly is a good place to go. A question about autonomous vehicles. So is that something that's going to solve the problem? Is that something you're excited about or concerned about? Things are changing really rapidly when it comes to that field.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like having sat on like a state work group for autonomous vehicles, like back in 2017, it was like, oh, they're coming. We got to do this right now. And the technology isn't there yet. And it's not going to be there in large parts of the country. I think, for a lot of time, the blind community was like promised and sort of dangled in front of us this, oh, well, this will work for you. But even if the technology is there, I think the cost piece is not going to work for so many people in the disability community. It's just not. And then are these companies going to choose to serve the areas where right now there's not ride hail, right? Because they're too rural or too poor, right? Those aren't options. And then wheelchair access is another huge thing, not being addressed right now. So I think it's a distraction, and I wish more of the resources that were being put into and have been put into developing this technology were actually put into investing in transit, investing in sidewalks, investing in, housing and land use changes, because those are the things that are going to get us into a place where our communities are more sustainable in the long run and more accessible to more people.
Yeah. So we have time for one last question, and it's from Seattle, so you'll appreciate this one. Somebody was saying she thinks it's really important to encourage teenagers and kids to use public transportation. That makes a lot of sense to me, right? Develop that support, develop the future advocates. But she knows a lot of parents who won't let their kids use transit because they feel like it's unsafe. Have you come across that at all?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we're really lucky in Washington State. Transit now is free for everyone under the age of 18.
Yeah.
And so, great, awesome, kids should be riding transit. But there is a narrative that transit is dangerous. And I think during the pandemic, I mean, I rode buses through the pandemic. There was a time where it was really hard because there weren't a lot of folks riding transit. And so, the experience wasn't great for a bit. But I think our transit agencies have really done a great job of recreating it as a space now that feels comfortable for families. But there's still this narrative that transit is dangerous and bad. And we need to push back against that very intentionally and not, I think, yeah. It's unfortunate because the reality is that driving is also dangerous and unhealthy and is more dangerous, right, in many ways. And so I think we need to do a better job of selling transit. But I know that it's a stigma. And I know even on my own block, like when the school bus was late last year and I wanted to bring the kids in on the bus, and the city bus instead, there was some resistance to doing that. So it is something that's out there, and we have to combat that narrative.
Yeah. So I just want to say thanks so much. I really appreciated your insight. I'm sure everybody else did. We now have a lot of places that we have to go travel to. And I want to thank everybody for participating, asking some great questions. You can all find a recording of our webinar on our website. It's enotrans.org. And the recording will also be emailed to everybody who registered. Make sure you sign up for our mailing list. You can gain access to our Eno Transportation weekly webinar announcements, report releases, and more. And reminded to check out the link in the chat box, and you can learn about donating or becoming an Eno member. And keep your eyes on our website because we have some more webinars coming up this fall. On the 25th of September, we'll be talking about success factors in private contracting for public transportation. So Anna, thanks so much. Really, really appreciated it. Thanks.
Thank you. Great chat.